Hello, I'm Dr. Mari Swingle, director of the Swingle Clinic and author of iMinds, How and Why Constant Connectivity is Rewiring Our Brains and What to Do About It. And today you're listening to myself and Dr. Brian Razzino on Bitesized Therapy.
Welcome to Bitesized Therapy podcast with Dr. Brian Razzino. Dr. Brian Razzino has over 20 years of experience as a talk therapist, and he uses short videos dealing with mental health issues in order to connect and educate hundreds of thousands of people. On this show, Dr. Razzino will make reference to his short clip videos and do his best to explain the mental issue referenced and how it can be addressed. Dr. Razzino does not give medical advice, but hopes that he can help people understand what is going on mentally in order to go ask for clarification with their own personal mental health professional. We watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix, and we did a little overview of it, and internet addiction came up. Can you talk about the brain waves and on the neuro, what's going on with the internet addiction? Because that's a big part of your book, iMinds, isn't it?
I do spend some time on that, but I also spend a lot of time on, more of the popular science. Now, not to be confused with pseudoscience, a lot of the social history, the development, I think that's really important as well. But from, the raw core hard science in around 2012 or so, I started seeing a really unique brainwave pattern in individuals who had been diagnosed with internet addiction. And I was looking for constellation patterns. I was looking for larger patterns of the brain. I was looking for patterns that are associated with other forms of addiction. And I found what I thought I'd find. But there's this really unique alpha undulation. And I started watching it with more attention. And in fact, over, I'd say, a 2-year period, I became very comfortable announcing that is the signature that we see with excessive exposure to interactive screen time. And I'm changing my term a little bit when we're talking about popular science. In terms the internal community, we still talk about internet addiction or IA. But for most parents, they speak about screen addiction. So that's why we hop back and forth between the terms. It means the same thing.
Can you show us what internet addiction looks like when you measure brain waves?
Yeah, this is it. You're looking at it now. What you're looking for is at location 01, so back of the brain in the occiput, what alpha does from an eyes open to an eyes closed condition. And when the alpha goes up by over 200%, that is the signature of deregulation associated with, internet or screen addiction. And, in terms of knowing if this is I hate to say real or not, because a lot of people question artifact. It's, that this is not artifact because it changes only with the condition of eyes open to eyes closed.
Are there subjective states that somebody could sort of report on that would go along with this spike in alpha? That would, is there in terms of the phenotype, is there anything behaviorally that we would look for, or subjectively?
Yeah. How long do you have? I think this is a marker for dissociation, but let me backtrack a little bit. We're looking at alpha. I call it the magic wave. It just has so many properties to it. But I mean, depending on how much people are into neuro, it's actually an idle wave or an idling wave. It's neither focus nor, lots of people think it's meditation. No, it's a readiness wave. Very, very different. And what we find is for individuals, when we don't get an alpha burst when you when you close your eyes, that's associated with another form of deregulation. We see that in trauma. Essentially, when people are trying to protect themselves from flashbacks, it's a closing down of the occipital lobe. When it goes up from approximately 50%, that's 50 to 80%, that's a healthy brain. That's exactly what it's supposed to be doing. When it goes up from 100 to 150%, that used to be highly associated with creativity. And I'm talking about in the classical sense, not just the modern sense of singing and dancing and painting, but the classical sense of what all that encompasses, which is essentially pattern recognition. Okay, so we're talking about higher levels of mathematics, architecture, musical composition, etc. So when we used to see that on children, we would celebrate it. And Dr. Razzino, you probably know what I'm talking about. When we see kids, parents are bringing them in for behavioral issues or attentional issues, and we're reporting all kinds of negative results, or should I say positive results about negative things. And the appointments can be really heavy. So when we saw this beautiful alpha burst on the child, we'd say, okay, little Farah, she obviously she has some signatures we see with issues with focus and attention. She has some behavioral issues, but she's creative, isn't she? And the parents light up, right? This is this beautiful news. There's this validation. Until I would say 2010 or so, started hearing they used to be, not they are. And what it is that creativity has been hijacked by gaming, or at the time it was gaming. And that's where I started, again, watching this wave. And when it goes over this 200%, it goes from a state of creativity to the hijacking, which completely goes into the gaming, and we lose the creativity. Yeah. So, and now, quite frankly, people, it's not even that they lost it, they never found it.
Question: what causes that?
We don't know. I don't know. I'm devoting a lot of time to figuring it out. The past year and a half, I've been collecting extensive data on where this is being seen. Oh gosh, it's hard to say years, but it was unilaterally with internet addiction or interactive screen addiction. But then there are always a couple of outliers. And I don't know about you folks, but outliers are really, really interesting. So I started looking at the outliers, and the outliers it's an 80-20 percentage, more or less. So 80% is the screen addiction, internet addiction. The outliers are sitting around 20%. Closed head injury, no surprise. Excessive marijuana use. Brain body illness. So what we're talking about is fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and then full-blown dissociation, even crawling into the schizophrenia area. That's where I'm looking at this being associated with different forms of dissociation, apart from the head injury. All of the issues I mentioned tend to be associated with dissociative states.
The outliers are not healthy brains.
Completely unhealthy brains. I mean, maximum definition of unhealthy brains.
Yeah.
What makes you an addict?
I go, with the classic definition of addiction, which is it's affecting other areas of your life, and you're unable to stop, despite knowing that it's affecting relationships, it's affecting your school, it's affecting your work, your sleep cycle, your eating cycle, etc. Classic definition of addiction is exactly the same.
Kids are sleeping less, and then they're gaming. So if they're not sleeping, they're playing the games, they're getting the blue light. Yeah. That's not a good recipe. Is that what you're saying, Dr. Swingle?
Understatement of the century, yes.
Kids are attracted to, with these abnormal EEGs, are attracted to games. People will say that, and they'll reverse the causality or try to say that there's mitigating factors. What about that? Like what sorts of external behaviors would parents look for that would be indicative of this kind of alpha, this out of control alpha?
Well, the key here is everybody's right. Okay. And I think we should all stop pounding our chests. Okay. And go for the components that are correct. But one of the things is I'm absolutely furious at the gaming industry because they cherry pick research. When you talk about how gaming improves spatial planning, yes, But, okay, because there's another caveat to it. But the key thing, again, talking about alpha, I'm talking this huge alpha deregulation I'm talking about. This is the bad stuff, okay? But if we're talking peak alpha is fantastic. You want tons of peak alpha. So what kind of alpha are we talking about? I'm going to be completely on PC. There's the slow and stupid alpha, which is your 8 to 9 hertz. Okay. There's your perfect peak alpha. And then there's your high alpha, which is associated with states of hyperarousal. You don't want that one. So which alpha are we talking about? And the gaming industry essentially just picks out the perfect results from professional gamers and then applies those results to children that are addicts. You're talking about chicken and egg. I'm talking about apples and oranges. I use the example of alcohol all the time, because people understand it.
Yep.
What are the effects of alcohol? Okay. When a sommelier drinks wine, okay, the cognitive centers of the brain light up because the relationship with alcohol is cognitive. That's your professional gamer, okay?
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at an addict, the emotional centers of the brain and the reward centers of the brain light up. It's a completely different process, okay? And when the gaming industry references the sommeliers and plops that research onto children who have an addiction issue, that's when I get furious. And then there's this nice group of us in the middle who enjoy alcohol socially here and there. Absolutely fine. I say alcohol is wonderful. It enhances the taste of food and conversation. Okay. If that's your relationship with gaming, if you enjoy gaming a little bit with your friends, if you're a 9-year-old boy and you game a little bit with your buddies and you go out and kick a soccer ball around, you ride your bikes and you bug your sisters, that's healthy. I have no issue with that form of gaming, but it tips over. And again, the gaming industry, the way they manufacture, they design the games, so it's very, very hard for the children and also adults to stop after a half an hour of gaming, to stop after 45 minutes, essentially to stop after 2 glasses of wine. And that's my issue.
I like the analogy of alcohol too, because it also gets into different kinds of metabolizers. Some people I shared, I knew a guy who once was the nicest guy in the world, but you get a couple of martinis in the guy and he's hell on wheels. You don't want to be around him.
That's another example I use, is how alcohol affects the brain. So the same substance, one person becomes an angry, vicious, violent drunk. Another person becomes the teary, my life is a mess and my boyfriend, blah, blah, over emotional. And other individuals become the life of the party. It's the same substance. Some people can drink, half a bottle of whiskey and they're relatively, I air quote, okay. They don't bumble, they don't stumble. My running joke is don't drive a car or sign a legal agreement.
Right.
But otherwise, they're, air quotes, okay. And another person, half a glass of 7% Vino Verde, and they're loopy. It's the same substance. There are specific genes. If we look at certain individuals whose genetics come from the Pacific Rim, they're literally allergic to alcohol. It's a pseudo poison. You get the flushing of the face. There are none of the positive effects that many Western Nordic peoples experience. And I giggle a little bit because of my red hair. There is actually, it's a phenotype where 65% of redheaded females process alcohol differently. It's the opposite. You actually have a higher tolerance for alcohol.
My daughter's a redhead.
Yeah, there you go. Well, she's going to be safer then.
She's got ADHD too. So which brings me to my next question, which is which kids with ADHD, with autism, with these neurodiverse issues that may lend them to be dysregulated or have sensation seeking or, need more variable rewards and stuff like that. What about that?
we're on another huge topic. I mean, let me go around the circle here.
Yeah.
So the larger global answer is folks in the middle. Okay, it's the people on the periphery. Okay, so individuals who I would say are exceptionally intelligent. I call them either busy-brained children, but I also lump in busy-bodied children. Okay, these are the kids that are really hard to parent and they're really hard to educate. But my gosh, they're so worth it. Okay, their brains are sponges. They're blooming Einsteins and Chomskys and Marie Curies, right? And you got to feed it. And that brain, if you don't feed it, it's going to seek out other things. Okay, and this is also why excessively intelligent children they're also, if we talk about the drugs as well, they've got a line dragging, okay? And it's a matter of what that line hooks. Does it hook on sport? Does it hook on drugs? Does it hook on engineering, okay? Or does it hook on gaming, okay? Because a brain that hungry, school is not enough. They're probably going to be bored out of their skull in school. Let's hop to the absolute other side. So when you're talking about true neurodiversity, okay, so sometimes we confuse busy-bodied children or very kinetic children with ADHD children. Maybe that's a whole other podcast if you're interested. But when we're talking about children on the spectrum, unnaturally attracted. And I am so conservative, it isn't funny on this. In the second edition of my book, I actually spent more time talking about this. I say if you have a child on the spectrum, do not permit them any technology whatsoever until the vast majority of their development is complete. And I do know that many professionals disagree with me. They say that this is a wonderful tool for socialization, for communication, etc. Neuronal pruning. If you provide the technologies too soon, essentially what you're doing is you're bending further into the autism as opposed to bending out of it developmentally. And I would say to a certain extent, that's also true with ADHD. Okay, when you have...
When you say bending further towards the autism, are we talking about more of a tendency to isolate and have an internal focus, internal world that becomes more of the priority?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah. And also depending on, I mean, there are many budding and many established theories of autism, and so much we don't understand, hence I say theory. But as we know, it's also a spectrum. But for many children with autism, you have hyperacusis, you have hypertactile sensitivity, you have great difficulty with reading of facial cues, etc. And one of the theories that I very strongly ascribe to is that you actually have the brain is too busy, and the gaming actually acts like an analgesic, meaning it counters that buzz in the brain, so the children calm. Okay, but the second they're off of the gaming, they're back to the real world, which is getting louder and louder because they're giving themselves that analgesic all the time. So they're not increasing a tolerance to clothing or tactile stimulation. They're not doing anything for the hyperacusis. Essentially, they're just shutting it out with counter arousal, which, I mean, if we talk about tinnitus, it's like once you take off the hyperarousal, the tinnitus is louder. It's not softer. Again, it's really hard to get all this info in a conversation in a podcast, but please, any parents and any individuals that work with children on the spectrum, look at this other body of knowledge. And this is not common in the pipeline. Most people are really promoting the technologies. If I can say one other thing, the lack of ability to read facial cues. Okay, this is one of the reasons that communicating by a screen is more comfortable is because it removes some of the cues, right? So again, you're feeding in, you're bending into an inability to read cues as opposed to, when children are younger, and you can guide the developmental ball a little bit more. See how far you can get with helping a child to learn facial cues, to learn to pace, to look away and to get eye contact, to pace the reading of cues, to not get overwhelmed with the reading of cues, as opposed to teach them technologies that help them to 100% avoid the reading of cues.
Is there outcome research on, sort of comparing, I don't know if you have a randomized controlled studies or anything like that, but like looking at outcomes or, that between populations of kids with autism or do electronics, don't do electronics? I mean,
yeah. So one of the issues that I have and many clinicians have is we have what we call dirty data. Okay.
Yeah. Imagine.
They're not controlled studies. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the critiques, and I'll walk through the critique, is that like it's all anecdotal. You're just talking about your own clients. Okay. But what I can speak to are individuals who follow the program versus individuals who don't. Okay. And I've had, many clients who have, followed the program. I show individuals what we see on the screen. And again, you can really, the brain waves don't lie. The brain doesn't lie. You can show the parents what you're talking about. And you can, the parents can watch the brainwaves change and they subjectively see the behaviors change. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. A lot of what we do is actually blind as well, that I'll read the brainwaves before I hear the parent's subjective report. So I'm not looking to match the report. It's exactly the opposite. But where I'm going with that is for some families that have trouble for whatever reasons, or do not dedicate themselves, frequently we'll see them a few years later saying, it's not getting better. We want to do this now. So it's kind of, it's a different format of data collection. So this is what I'm speaking about. A 9-year-old male brought in for mild issues with focus and anxiety, didn't have the official labels, but essentially ADHD and anxiety. Excessive screen use was identified, but the child and the family were unable or unwilling to discontinue the gaming. Okay, they didn't take it seriously. So you can see initially there definitely was an issue because it's 279. 4 years later, they come back. It's 307. And 1 year later, it's 579. And that's okay. So this is pretty black and white. Give you a second one. This is an 18-year-old. Marked ADHD and anxiety. So 2014, we're dealing with 194. And 2014, 598. And you can see how it just projects up. And now where this really gets interesting is I want to show you what's also happening with theta at the back of the brain. So the theta beta ratio, the higher that is, the lower your anxiety is, meaning you have higher stress tolerance when your theta beta ratio is up. So for those of you watching who really don't know what we're talking about, your theta wave is your slow, sleepy, relaxed wave. It has a nice slow undulation between 3 and 7 hertz. You want a lot of that in the back of the brain because that's the part of the brain responsible for quieting. Beta has a much faster undulation. It's from 16 to 25 hertz, nice and fast. It's associated with focus, concentration, being on the ball. Okay, you don't want that at the back of the brain. You kind of want it in the, over the central motor cortex. So that's what I'm talking about. Your theta beta ratio. How strong is your slow, quiet wave to your fast on the ball wave? And here we can see those same years. It was 175 and it went down to 1.42. Okay. Same thing with the 18-year-old. It was already pretty low, 1.36, and you can see it goes down. So what we're talking about here is an inverse relationship. As your gaming goes up, and I get that, I call it the internet addiction or the gaming addiction. I mean, it's YouTube, it's everything now, but essentially the excessive screen use marker goes up. The protection factor of anxiety and emotional deregulation goes down. And this is what I was speaking to before. Okay. If we look at this component, okay, so this arrow is speaking to the alpha marker. So if it's, below 50 or so, these are individuals, bless them, but they're just not too creative. Then you go into the range, 100 and 150, even up to 180. Okay. Those are individuals that have really good creativity. Okay. These are you see this in inventors, you see this in entrepreneurs, and of course, individuals that we speak of as artists. And then it crosses over. So once it crosses the, 200 mark, this is the deregulation marker. And this is what I see in individuals who are using interactive screens excessively, as well as those other, that 20%, the outliers, excessive marijuana use, different forms of dissociation, different forms of brain-body illness, as well as closed head injury. And again, this one is your theta beta ratio that's just tanking in the back of the brain.
Dr. Swingle, you could be an NFL player and you could have brain damage. You could be a professional gamer and have damage, right? Just a different. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you for actually speaking to that, because that's something that I talk about. In the book, an example came in. There was a young man who came in, a university student, who came in. He really wanted help with his anxiety and his sleep. And I saw this marker, and I'm like, hey, buddy, okay, I know what you're doing. Okay. I said, you're gaming too much. You have to stop. And, it was kind of like a cinematograph scene. He just took his hands and, he had, straight floppy black hair and just kind of flopped down, and you could just see him go into this kind of depressive slump. And then, when he lifted his eyes, he shared with me that he was a professional gamer. And yes, he was a university student, but the way he was paying for his education was through gaming. And this was like, okay, you have some choices. Now, when I'm dealing with, an 18 or 23-year-old who's essentially at school, parents are paying for everything, they can only take a couple of classes because they can't focus, and they're gaming all night. That person, I'll say, no, you have a choice. I'll work with you, but you got to stop the gaming, right? But this young man, I use the American football analogy. People talk about gladiators, right? It's like, okay, you want to stay in the game. I can help you to moderate your sleep, and I can help you to essentially moderate your anxiety. I said, but do you know the risks, right? It might be exaggerating a little bit to talk about concussion, etc., but we're not going to quote unquote cure this. And the only way to get back to full brain health is if you consider, once you have your degree, then you stop this career, right? And I don't have the answers. How many years do you have to be gaming? And I'm not even talking about professional gamers. Like, we're looping back to neuronal pruning. How long until this is permanent? I have beautiful news, though, in terms of just the way with excessive marijuana users. When people stop doping themselves up, 3 months is the cutoff. Alpha just goes right down. Okay. And I see this as well with my gamers. And I tease them. I say, that alpha's coming up again. So it's a deregulation marker. It autocorrects. And it's beautiful. Like I don't train this. In fact, I refuse to train it because this tells me about brain health.
So it's a little bit like the liver coming back after someone
Yeah,
stops drinking.
yeah,
It starts to repair itself. And
yeah.
let me ask you a question about the ratio, theta beta ratio, right? It's theta beta, right?
Yeah.
Got that right? So are there is there a zone? There's a zone in there that's healthy, and then like where it gets outside of it becomes unhealthy. What numbers are those? And then like are there other? Well, yeah. What would that range be? Do you think?
Yeah.
Uh,
So the cutoff that I've chosen, and it's not arbitrary. It just seems to be a really healthy one on the yes/no continuum, which is 200. If it's over 200, this is where you're not in the creative region anymore. There's some issue with brain health.
right. And as you said, like in your uh, population, you got about 20% of some of the other issues. And is there data out there though that shows that over 200 you start to get a much higher incidence of certain kinds of psychiatric issues like depression, anxiety?
Yeah, this is all emergent research. It's my research. I
Yeah.
just presented it at AAPB. I presented it at BFE. And essentially people are nodding along, meaning other people are starting to see this. This is clinical research. So essentially the first presentation I was at around 850 individuals with this signature. And I'm now up to around 1,500. So there's some pretty big numbers.
Wow. Yeah, you doubled. Yeah.
Can you talk about the connection between a caregiver and children and the mental health outcomes? What happens when the parents are staring at the phone and not at the kid's eyes?
You don't develop. Yeah. This is attachment 101. Okay. Just go back to our foremothers and forefathers, Ainsworth, Shore, Bowlby, Lerner. We know this stuff. It's primary attachment, from the day of birth to 3. It's face to face, heart to heart, touch, a voice prosody. This is how all primary emotional systems are set up. And we've learned this, from Latin adoption. We've learned this, unfortunately, from many of the little girls who came out of China, wherein they were placed in orphanages. They were fed, their nappies were changed, but the one thing they didn't get was touch. They didn't get caretaker interaction. And we know that's long-term development. That doesn't go back. Okay. And that, here we really are talking about neuronal pruning. One of the other things I want to talk about is, we talk about the child's use, okay, on the screen, but the other is the parent's use, right? And in my generation, well, when a child is always on their device or their phone, they're not present with the child. And you're better off being in another place, and you're better off being completely absent than being present with your child on your device. Because most of us, we just get mesmerized. We're not paying attention. That's a whole other chapter. But in my time, when you did that with a child, that was a form of punishment. It was called the silent treatment, meaning you're not important. My device is more important. And that's the constant message that we're inadvertently giving children now, that they're secondary to the device. And of course, the children want the devices. They're mimicking us, right?
I was just going to say, is there a difference between gender? If you ignore a male child, they'll get more upset than ignoring a female child.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I read the studies too. I think we're over genderized in that regard. Don't get me going. Other things, I think there are very, very definite differences in gender, and I don't think we should smush everything into mashed potatoes here. But this is one where I think I think it's pretty equal. It's different reasons, you know.
I saw it in my kids.
Sorry?
I mean, I definitely saw it in my cats. I mean, like they would start to fight more. They had more questions. They had more things they needed help with, all of these things. And the take home message was, get off your fucking phone, Dad.
Yeah.
I mean, basically they're like, or, or if my wife is on her phone, I can, and she's upstairs and I'm downstairs and the kids are upstairs, I hear, more commotion and stuff like that. So it's one of those things that definitely raises a flag for you. And you kind of ask yourself, okay, what's going on here? What are we doing? And then also, of course, the modeling of, what are we teaching our kids in terms of how we use it. So now, I mean, it is nice.
Eating with your phone. I mean,
that's right.
Wrong with that.
That's right. That's exactly right. And there's nothing wrong. It's totally natural. And it's actually, I'm glad that we actually have some like real books that we can hold now, and because we can actually read those and they can see us reading like a book instead of being on our phone reading a book where they don't know what we're doing, and then they're sort of like
the other thing here, we want to talk a little bit about temporal sequencing as well, okay, and what different modalities do to our attention. All right, when you're reading a book, you have complete control. Okay, you can lift your eyes and say, 2 minutes, my dear. I just want to finish this paragraph. Okay, and you come back after those 2 minutes. You actually you're in control of the pacing of the absorption of the material that you're engaging with. We don't have that with our interactive devices. Now, again, if you want to get into it, there's a whole reason for that in terms of the attention economy and how they're designed to grab the attention.
What are we looking at? What are the implications of this? What should we be looking at? I mean, like, are we thinking about kids that, well, I mean, are we like looking at higher rates of anxiety and depression that we can tag to early parent electronic use? I mean, I'm not being, I mean, I think like, I'm serious. I mean, like, because I have a family, by the way, and I'll try to stay focused here, but I have plenty of families with ASD kids. The whole family like games, and it's like from the hours of 4 to 7, everybody's online doing their gaming or whatever. And so what you talked about in terms of turning more to the autism, I mean, that's certainly the case in some of the families that I see. And part of that is because they've all kind of got similar characteristics. But what are we looking at population-wise? Are we looking at something that's more of a public health crisis kind of issue, or?
I think we're there. I really think we're there. And, I'm not too concerned about me. I mean, I don't mind disclosing I'm in my mid-50s. My development was complete, when interactive screens came in. But we are literally hijacking biology. We're in a live experiment. We don't know what the final outcome is. And when this is being used in prime developmental years, we're guiding our own development, and the evidence is there, especially when very young. We can't reverse it. Like, once you're on that path, once something's been pruned, it's been pruned. And I'll just go through my little spiel here. If you don't want to affect attachment, you don't want to use this stuff until age 3. If you don't want to affect attentional systems and the vestibular system, certain aspects of learning, you don't want to use this until age 9. If you don't want to affect psychosocial development and psychosexual development, you don't want to use this until age 15. I can go on and on and on. Now, some support here. I'm happy that this is coming out, but it was never hidden. It just wasn't publicized. The individuals at the onset of the development of these technologies did not let their own children use it. majority of people send, I don't know whether I want to publicize the schools, but essentially they send them to private schools or schools that follow certain learning systems where technology is not introduced until age 12. I think that's very appropriate. I'm not anti-technology. I'm anti the free-for-all. I'm anti the absolute override. It should be used as a complement, not an override. It should be a complement, not competitive. And if you'll just permit me to go in deeper in this, a colleague, her name is Dr. Silva out of Australia. I actually want to reach out to her because a few years ago, she was just at the beginning of some research, but she's a pediatrician. And she was noticing that she was getting more and more infants who had failed smile response. And the parents were bringing them in essentially because they weren't reaching developmental markers. So she just asked her receptionist, hey, just would you mind having a peek at what these families are doing in the waiting room? I mean, she obviously had an idea. And you can figure out what this was. The families that were coming in for that specific issues, either the parents were on their devices or the children, meaning what I call iPad in the cradle. So the shocking part here isn't that the children weren't developing the smile response. What's frightening me from a cultural level is the parents had the wherewithal to know something was wrong and the wherewithal to bring their children to a pediatrician, but they couldn't figure out the connection, that they were not spending primary face-to-face, heart-to-heart time with their children. And there are numerous studies in terms of, all you have to do is take the phone away for so many days and the ability to read facial cues. Looping back into the autism, we're seeing children without autism developing autistic characteristics because of the way the phone is training, or sorry, the gaming, all of the systems. We're talking about, inhibition response, game, I can go on and on and on. I have a nice little chart on what playing in nature does to development versus playing in bound systems. Talk about attention spans. We're training our children to not be able to focus on regular life. They only train to high stimulation. This is entrainment. This is what we're doing in neurotherapy, except in reverse.
Right.
We talk about children and ADHD and danger. Okay. If children are always playing in bound systems with the redo, they don't learn respect for danger.
Do you think this is sort of more of an urban problem where families are cooped up in their apartments and they don't have access to parks and recreation that, we might otherwise, experience in a suburb or something? I mean, are there geographic and
people are going to hate me. That's a cop out. Okay. But there are certain underprivileged neighborhoods where they're just blocks and blocks without a tree, and those
or it's violence. It's a violent area.
And those communities, there's a reason. But for the majority of us, pardon me, that's hogwash. Majority of communities, there's a park down the street. Okay, there's a bus you can hop on. There's a swimming pool. There's a public swimming pool. The space does not have to be big. And also, in rural environments, you have just as many gamers on farms and in forests, just because the environment, people are not using what they have.
Yeah. I just wonder if it would be correlated with a poverty index or something like that, just based off of...
It's poverty of environment.
Poverty of environment. Yeah.
Which sometimes does go with economic poverty. Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's
but you could see it in a high achieving rich family too, right? You could.
Well, you want to talk of poverty of time, right?
Yes.
It's like, how do you define poverty?
Yeah.
If you talk about you could be very, very poor, financially, but if you're spending tons of time with your children,
right. Right.
and you're taking them to the park, your children are going to be so rich developmentally. Okay,
Yeah.
and that's the way to break cycles. But I mean, obviously, if somebody is that poor, they're working extensive hours. I mean, there's so many layers to all of this. But what I'm saying is, for majority, it's pretty blanketed, and it's a cop out. All you need is one.
Yeah. I just think about I think about the traps, and because there are so many traps that we find ourselves inadvertently just stepping into. And like you said, if the gaming or the interface with technology, it is an analgesic, it is people do use it as a stress, modifier or whatever to cope, then parents are doing that too. And it's accelerating because our world is getting busier and more stressful. And so the key for parents to cue in on is, to first of all, the reduction of electronics, putting the phone away, not only helps your bonding with your child, but it also will take away some of the stress that you're experiencing too, because you're actually, it's like, sort of like a drug, right? It becomes your enemy, and it sort of introduces more stress than it relieves. You got to start more of a virtuous cycle versus that vicious cycle.
Yeah.
But I could see that we know how it kind of got to the point where it is now, which is it's an easy trap to step into.
Well, I mean, if we really want to talk about families and failures of family systems and community systems, okay, the issue, it's a form of a parenting trap. Okay,
Yeah.
parents were using it as a babysitter, and many
Yeah.
individuals, when we started doing this, nobody had any idea how bad it was. Okay, and
Yeah.
the primary issue now is parents are massively overworked, exhausted, and time deprived. And depending on where you live in the Western world, but the majority of the Western world, we have removed our social, functional, and financial support of young families. Okay, parents are exhausted. Okay, so I don't blame parents. Okay, but what I think we need to do is get back a little bit to old world where you get to know your neighbors. Okay, and if you're exhausted, throw your kids over to the neighbors. Okay, what's the difference between having 2 kids around and 3 kids around? Okay, and then you and your partner might be able to have a 2-hour nap, a nice walk, do the laundry or make love.
That's my strategy.
Yeah.
We love having kids over because it means our kids are having fun and occupied. And
yeah. But it also might mean that another parent gets some reprieve.
Absolutely. No, we have arrangements in our neighborhood. Like, we understand,
beautiful. Yeah.
If we do a play date, we don't have to really, but then they're going to do a play date, and we'll sort of,
but you have to watch the catches. If you have to drive an hour for a play date and you're sitting in the car, time management is a big one.
I'd love to have you back on there. I think this is great.
Yeah, we didn't even get to medications yet.
Well, as I said, this is almost 100 pages, right?
All the parents that are watching and listening, how can they find your book, Dr. Murray?
It's here we go, shameless promotion. Okay, it's essentially available everywhere. You can get it through your bookstores, online. It's an audio book. It actually is an electronic version. Just don't read it close to sleep. Yeah. But it's all in there. And please, I'm not anti-technology. I'm against the way we're using it.
Yeah. No, and I'm glad that you reiterate that, because I think that people do, like the lump, and we're talking about really hard stuff, which is we all have to take a look at our behaviors, and we have to make adjustments. We have to change we're all locked into some habits right now that are not good for us, and they're habits that we're going to resist giving up. And it's easy to hide behind Murray, she's a radical, she's all extreme and stuff like that. But the fact is, you're offering an approach that's realistic and it's balanced. So, I mean, there's not, which means there's some good news, but there's also some tough news.
Well, let's just say, I'm a private practitioner, and I'm really, really tired of seeing all of the emotional deregulation that's avoidable. You're keeping me in business for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
Dr. Mary Swingle, Dr. Brian Razzino, thank you so much for coming on Bite-Sized Therapy.